Okay, so you want to own a skyscraper. Steel and glass climbing into the clouds. Hundreds of tenants paying rent for the privilege of working or living above everyone else in the city. A landmark with your name on it that people photograph from the street below. It's the ultimate real estate trophy. And unlike almost any other asset class, the building itself becomes a permanent piece of the skyline the moment it's finished. That is the dream, and it is not entirely wrong. Here's what it doesn't tell you. A skyscraper can be fully sold out, fully occupied, and financially successful by every visible measure, and still be quietly sinking into the ground beneath it, inch by inch, for years before anyone notices. Let's start with what it costs to build one. Industry data for 2025 and 2026 puts high-rise construction at $250 to $700 per square foot in the United States, with premium towers in dense urban cores running $700 to $1,500 or more. A mid-rise building of 20 to 40 floors typically runs $100 to $500 million. A tall tower of 40 to 70 floors runs $500 million to over $1 billion. And anything genuinely super tall, 70 floors and above, commonly exceeds $1 to $3 billion. Real examples show the spread clearly. The Palazzo in Las Vegas cost $1.8 billion. One World Trade Center cost $3.8 billion. And the ultra-slender 111 West 57th Street on Manhattan's Billionaires Row cost $2 billion to build, a figure that only makes sense once you see its penthouses selling for $45 to $57 million apiece. Land itself can be the single largest variable. Unimproved land in Midtown Manhattan is priced in the thousands of dollars per square foot, while a comparable plot in a smaller market can cost a small fraction of that before a single beam goes up. Before you pour a foundation, you run into the part of skyscraper economics that almost nobody outside the industry understands. Height doesn't just cost more, it costs more per floor the higher you go. Every additional story demands a stronger structural frame, more advanced elevator systems, and thicker foundations to carry the growing weight above, which is why the cost curve for supertalls is famously U-shaped rather than flat. Vertical transportation alone, meaning high-speed elevators and sky lobbies, can consume 30 to 40% of a supertall's total floor area, space that generates zero rental income, despite being some of the most expensive square footage in the building. Foundations for very tall buildings often require deep piles, caissons, or rock-socketed shafts driven far below the surface to reach adequate bearing capacity. And this single decision, how deep and how solidly you anchor the building, turns out to be the difference between a landmark and a lawsuit. Once construction wraps, soft costs, meaning permitting, design fees, legal work, and financing charges, rather than physical materials, typically add another 20 to 30% on top of the hard construction budget. And skyscraper financing is rarely simple. Because the sums involved are so large, developers assemble what's called a capital stack, layering their own equity with multiple tiers of debt and outside investment, which means a single skyscraper project can have dozens of stakeholders with competing claims on the building's eventual cash flow, long before it ever generates a dollar of rent. Here's the trap sitting underneath the entire business, and it's the one that separates a merely expensive project from a genuine catastrophe. Skyscrapers are profit maximized at a specific height, the point where the cost of adding one more floor just equals the additional rent that floor can command. Push past that point purely for prestige or record-breaking ambition, and the economics can turn against the developer, even before opening day. Analysis of One Vanderbilt in New York found a benefit-to-cost ratio suggesting roughly a 4% return on investment. half the historical average for pre-World War II towers, precisely because the cost of going extremely tall has outpaced what tenants are actually willing to pay per square foot for the privilege. Once a tower is leased or sold, the revenue model runs through familiar real estate layers, just at an enormous scale. Office towers collect rent priced per square foot, with premium addresses in cities like New York commanding $160 per square foot or more, while comparable space in cheaper global markets like Shanghai rents for roughly half that. Individual units outright, often at wildly escalating prices the higher the floor, since height itself has become one of the most reliable premium features in luxury real estate. The same instinct that makes people pay more to sit closer to the front of an airplane. Amenity space, retail at street level, and parking add secondary income streams. And for the most exclusive towers, the building's name and address alone function as a marketing asset that lets developers charge far above the surrounding market. Now, the disaster case study. And it's one of the most quietly alarming skyscraper stories in modern American real estate. Millennium Tower in San Francisco opened in 2009 as a $350 million, 58-story luxury condominium tower, and by 2013 had generated $750 million in total unit sales, a strong 25% return on its development cost. It was, by every visible financial measure, a triumph. The problem was invisible until it wasn't. The developer had chosen to anchor the building on friction piles driven 60 to 90 feet into soft clay and sand, rather than extending them all the way down, roughly 200 feet to bedrock, a decision that saved money during construction but left the tower's foundation resting on soil that continued compressing under the building's own weight for years afterward. The tower had been engineered to settle no more than 12 inches over its entire lifetime. By the mid-2010s, it had already sunk more than 17 inches and was measurably leaning. And by the time the situation became public in 2016, residents were rolling golf balls across their living room floors to demonstrate the tilt to journalists. 9 separate lawsuits involving roughly 400 individual parties ultimately targeted the developer, the city's building department, and the Trans-Bay Joint Powers Authority, whose adjacent transit center construction the developer blamed for further destabilizing the soil. Claims that together were alleged to total $1 billion or more. The eventual settlement required a $100 million engineering fix, drilling 52 new piles down 250 feet into actual bedrock, nearly 3 times deeper than the tower's original foundation. And even the city itself was drawn in, contributing $30 million toward the settlement, despite never accepting responsibility for the tower's movement. The building had sold out, generated real profit, and won architectural praise, and it still became a landmark case study in structural litigation because a single foundation decision made years before anyone moved in had been quietly compounding the entire time. Let's run the numbers on 2 scenarios. Optimistic case, you build a $600 million, 50-story mixed-use tower with a foundation properly anchored to bedrock from day one in a strong urban market. Office and residential space leases and sells at premium rates, generating $80 million a year in stabilized net operating income once fully occupied, against debt service and operating costs of roughly $50 million. Leaving a genuine $30 million annual return on an asset that will remain structurally sound and marketable for a century or more. Realistic case? The same $600 million tower, but built on a shortened, cheaper pile foundation to save costs during construction, similar to the decision made at Millennium Tower. The building leases up successfully, generates strong early cash flow, and looks identical to the optimistic scenario for years. Then, subsurface settlement becomes measurable. Buyers and tenants grow alarmed, litigation begins, and a $100 million plus remediation bill arrives at the exact moment the building's reputation, and therefore its resale value, has already been damaged, turning a decade of solid returns into a legal and financial crisis that erases years of accumulated profit in a single settlement. So, if you decide to own a skyscraper, understand what you're actually buying. You're not buying a finished permanent structure the moment the ribbon is cut. You're buying a decades-long bet that a foundation decision made before a single tenant moved in was the right one, in ground you can't see, carrying a weight that never stops testing that decision. Anchor it properly, and a skyscraper can be one of the most enduring, high-status assets in commercial real estate. Cut the wrong corner at the foundation stage, and you can sell out every unit, turn a real profit, and still spend the next decade in litigation over a building that's sinking beneath the very success you built on top of it.